This is episode number 9 of DTY Talks, and today we're talking to Dr. Kogan, the medical director of the GW Center for Integrative Medicine, an approach to care that addresses the full range of physical, emotional, mental, social, spiritual, and environmental influences that affect a person's health. He's here to tell us all about the future of this practical approach to medicine.
Misha?
Thank you, Dr. Kogan, for joining us for DTY Talks. As I mentioned, my name is Kayana, and we're just going to chat for the next hour or so and get to know you, get to know a lot about what you do, and introduce our audience to the ins and outs of integrative medicine. So, are you ready?
I am.
Wonderful, wonderful. So, I wanted to start off with just a little bit of history. The Greek physician Hippocrates is said to be the father of modern medicine. And integrative medicine is actually, which I'm sure you're going to explain to us, is a practice that is probably thought of as something that's most true to the foundation of medicine. Can you tell us what integrative medicine is and how it stays true to honoring Hippocrates' philosophies?
Well, unfortunately, let me start from a little diversion. I think it'll help.
Okay.
Unfortunately, I don't think the public really understands well what integrative medicine. I think the part of it is just the history. The traditional terms we used to use for this field, which are not actually correct terms, they were CAM, or complementary and alternative medicine. And, in reality, integrative medicine is really not about complementary and alternative modality. In reality, integrative medicine is a philosophically different approach to our current allopathic or what we sometimes call Western model. The difference is, or the sort of the key philosophical, is that we do believe that the body does have innate natural capacity to take care of most of its problems. And even when the problems appear to be severe, most of the time there's simply a lack of some kind of a balance within the system that if factors interfering in healing are removed, the body will take care of itself. And this does go in a philosophical disagreement with the allopathic medicine, where typically there's diagnosis that requires specific intervention. In integrative medicine, we never stop at point of diagnosis, because point of diagnosis is potentially a superficial way of looking at the situation or a problem. And if you dig deeper, if you actually look at dysregulation, if you look at the root cause of a diagnosis, that's what we go for. And because addressing that root cause has, in many cases, substantially more likelihood of completely resolving the problem. Can I give an example?
Sure. Go ahead.
So traditionally, we used to think of condition, for example, of diabetes as a simple dysregulation of insulin because there's too much sugar and then builds insulin resistance. Well, that's all correct, and those are pathophysiologic understandings of actual process of diabetes. However, if you look at the model from a more integrative approach, you begin to very quickly realize that there are a variety of different metabolic root causes of diabetes, and some of them your listeners may have never heard at all. For example, a toxicity. There's a small proportion of all diabetics are completely caused by specific toxins. There could be pesticides, there could be, I had one patient earlier in my career who basically developed type 1 diabetes, and, within a pretty quick time frame, we have figured out that he was a painter and he was intoxicated by solvents that were mixed with the paint. So, this type of level of figuring out underlying causality is often lacking in Western medicine, and it's highly appraised in an integrative medicine. Now, once you establish that causality, the actual toolbox, and I'm going to just make an accent on it, it's just the toolbox, even though it's often thought to be as different from allopathic medicine, in a way it doesn't really matter whether I use an herb, a drug, or acupuncture to address that root causality or a lifestyle change, like change in the diet, to me, that's just tools of a trade. In themselves, it's not necessarily defined what integrative medicine is. Yes, probably most integrative practitioners would be more likely to first utilize more, quote-unquote, natural methods that may be safer, maybe less efficacious in the beginning, but nonetheless safer. And again, to me, that's only, that may be a trademark of our field, but it's not necessarily how I tend to think about it. It's really what in a moment is going to be most efficacious and safest for the patient, and it doesn't really matter what the tool is as long as we know that we're using the tool appropriately. If you look at definition into what integrative medicine is, which former consortium of academic health centers for integrative medicine that has now since changed its name, came up with, the definition is extremely close to definition of primary care medicine. I can't quite remember it. We can find it for your listeners if you're interested. But in reality, it simply summarizes what I just said in 2 or 3 sentences. And it puts an accent on that statement at the end that utilization of all evidence-based tools, regardless of their nature of origin. So whether that tool is within biomedicine or outside of biomedicine, like Chinese medicine, which often does not fit easily into a biomedical model, it's much more of a energy-based approach, that itself becomes a secondary issue. Choosing the modality, choosing the actual root, choosing actual treatment for the root cause is, again, secondary. And I think that's confusing for a lot of people because everybody just immediately jumped to a conclusion that integrative medicine is just you use medication and then you use herb at the same time. We have a great term for that. Do you know what that is?
No, what is it?
It's called greenopathy.
Greenopathy, okay.
Yeah, it simply means instead of using a drug, you're going to use an herb. And, there's sometimes situations where it's valuable, but most of the time it's a wrong philosophical approach. And it's wrong in a core because it doesn't address the fact that, whatever you do, your first priority to the patient is to really try to figure out the causality.
Right.
If I were to say, I wouldn't use the word diagnosis, I would basically say to figure out the root cause of a problem. And it could be diagnosis. Sometimes it is diagnosis. Sometimes it's just diagnosis. That's enough for certain situations. And sometimes, most of the time, it's not. Sorry, that was a long answer.
No, it's quite all right. Don't worry about that. It's we do want you to feel comfortable with just going forward. I mean, whatever comes to mind in an answer. And I did get the chance to look up more of a formal definition for integrative medicine. And it is an approach to care that puts the patient at the center and addresses the full range of physical, emotional, mental, social, spiritual, and environmental influences that affect a person's health. So it is, like you said, it's everything. It's the totality of a person's life and lifestyle. And so with that said, there is a quote, going back to sort of the history of it, because as I was doing my research just to familiarize myself with the term integrative medicine, because I didn't know. I mean, you hear these words thrown around, but I didn't know exactly what it was. And that's where the whole Hippocrates thing came from, because, the father of medicine. And one thing that he said is it's more important to know what sort of person has a disease rather than to know what sort of disease a person has. That's a slogan that I think I start half of all my presentations with, because wonderful. I think one of my students recently at one of the lectures said something very profound, which I think is very specific to this conversation. She said, what integrative medicine does for her, whenever she starts remembering, it's a framework. It's a capacity to stand back from the problem and see the forest behind the trees. It's this kind of
ability to not get wrapped up in each specific detail in the details of the disease and see that whole person, see the process that the person going through in the whole person context. Believe it or not, on the day-to-day operations, when we're busy, when we're running around doing different tasks, it's not so simple. And I think a lot of what patients' frustration is about is the fact that often we fail to see patients behind the disease process. We just we manage the numbers, we manage whatever, And this point is not specific to integrative medicine. I think the integrative medicine just helps us to keep that frame of mind clear, so that we're always capable of, in addition to seeing the numbers, in addition to seeing whatever else we have to do, we're also always seeing the whole person. That part actually does take some training. Maybe if the core tools of integrative medicine require some learning as well, of course, some of them. But I think it's not just about going to a fellowship or the residence school learning. I think it's making sure that you, over a period of time, learn how to see the whole person all the time. Yeah, that's years, I think, of ongoing work. So it's not, we're not worried about computers taking over.
It seems like it could be kind of difficult to do, though, because when you mention seeing a whole person, and for instance, if you were to have a patient and you look at their diet and you looked at their lifestyle as far as exercise, that's one thing. But how, or I guess I should ask, is it more difficult to help a person when they can't change their entire environment? For instance, if their house has mold that's contributing to a problem, they can't just move. So how do you approach, a patient with those kind of restrictions?
Well, I think certain things don't have answers. I'll tell you. The example you just gave me, I have no idea how to help this person.
Right.
If they're continuously exposed to a toxicity like this, you could try to do some palliation, and, you could try to minimize toxin exposure. You can put air filter in the house. You can give them some toxin binders that they can take orally. I can send them for sonas. But those are very superficial methods. As long as toxic exposure continues. So, it's another kind of a very important point. The medicine is so much more than just medicine, right? It's all kinds of social determinants of health. And sometimes we, as a physician, have a relatively limited amount of control over that. So, interesting you mentioned mold. I don't know if that was on the script or not, but, we do a lot of the care for patients toxic with mold, and one of the first things we ever do, we send an expert examiner to the house to make sure that there is no mold. If there is, then they need to remediate it or do something. We're not in the business of addressing every social problem.
Right.
I know you guys, your company is up front of the whole pack. You solved one immediate huge problem. You go to the patient's houses, at least you can get a good idea of the environment. Quite often, patients coming to physicians' offices, you have no idea what's going in a house. I'm a geriatrician by training. I still see a lot of elderly, and you often get a sense that the house is unsafe, and you have to make sure that somehow it gets evaluated. You know how many times I have to call Adult Protective Services because I'm concerned that there's hurting in a house, but not much I can do about that. I can go to their house, but they often wouldn't even let me in. I've had that situation.
Wow. So in your profession, or I guess in your discipline, what tools or even other disciplines are important for you to do your job?
Well, I think I'd start out with a team. I think one of the most important quote-unquote tools, not a tool, but, is I think to have, it's not just about a doctor. In fact, I think integrative medicine in many aspects puts this non-hierarchical, horizontal model of care where physicians just one, speck in the wheel is first. I think in a lot of more traditional practices, in certain subspecialties, it's still very top-down, right? So you have a physician, and then you have a nurse, and and I think in integrative medicine, where lots of things depend on the patient's lifestyle choices, on motivating them appropriately. I think, a physician may come up with the best ideas, but if they cannot be implemented effectively, things are not going to go well. So we tend to make sure that, person works closely with whatever the infrastructure that's required, whether it's a health coach. If they can't afford the health coach, sometimes the best quote-unquote health coach could be a spouse, or it could be, their personal trainer in the gym. And so you, in addition to getting to know the patient, which is, as you pointed out with the exact quote, is more important than knowing the disease, you also have to learn their social structure, their support system, and plug, and then we plug our team into that one way or another. And sometimes this most important motivator could be part of the team. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's a very surprising part of the team. Sometimes it's my front desk person, our front desk person, because they in the clinic, every couple of weeks, and they start developing a relationship. So, that's a really important part. I think another really important part in kind of this whole process is, to making sure that that priorities that the physician has are in sync with the patient's priorities. We're way too often treating or addressing things we want to address without actually knowing what's important for the patient. I will never forget my first case. There's a very old woman with diabetes, and she was very brittle. Every little complication, she'll end up in the hospital. And that, like, on the admission number, whatever, I kind of ask her, I keep chasing this process and trying to make you more stable, and I'm like, I think like I'm failing, and she's like, oh honey, that's still not important. I just like to see you, and whether I'm in the hospital or I'm at home, yeah, I'm sick, I know I'm not going to have a lot of time, but for her it was just this ongoing process of relationships, and she didn't see her illness the same way I was seeing, so she wasn't really frustrated. She really cared that there were people caring about her, but for her, the importance was that she just maximizes her quality of care, and we're not necessarily chasing, diabetic parameters, and and so sometimes we have disconnect between what we as a providers think is important and what. So that always is the first step, I think, for us to make this work most efficacious. And sometimes because of that, certain sacrifices have to be made, because we may not be in a good alignment. I think being clear about kind of how you manage your business and how the clinic is run. I think there are a lot of wonderful practices out there that are not integrative, large universities and such, where a patient really starts feeling like a little speck of a dust in a big machine. And they would love their doctor, but they would say, and I have a unique perspective, I work simultaneously in my own practice, in our own practice, and in a large university, and so I see how it is. And, so I think establishing this healing environment for the patient, even before they actually get to start working on their health, having the office appear structured towards the healing, having the website accordingly, and having all your tools aligned with the healing process instead of, a business or entity or corporation. There's the medicine has definitely become a business over the past decade or two, and I think patients don't like it. Many practitioners don't like it. There are ways of handling this a little softer, I think a little better, starting from simple things like just the color of the walls in the clinic, or you guys don't have a clinic, right? So when you go to the patient, the way you come, how you approach them, the how you communicate. I mean, all those things may appear little, but that's where it all starts.
And one of the things that some folks may or may not know, but integrative medicine really, really emphasizes that the patient and their physician are partners in the healing process. How do you emphasize that with your patients?
Well, I started kind of alluding to this, right? So if you're in an environment that looks very sterile, that looks very medical, it's hard for the patient to feel comfortable, right? So you have to create this partnership from the place of comfort. It needs to be on the same level. If you come in this paternalistic, I'm God and I know what I'm doing, it's going to be very hard to create this alliance.
Right.
You know, and I think integrative medicine, generally speaking, is a lot more maternalistic. It's a lot more partnership-like, even in its core of delivering, not necessarily just in a room with a patient, but even at the team approach. It's already, you know, once you remove this hierarchical structure, I know what I'm doing and you have to follow, you know, and instead saying, look, we don't know all the answers. Let's figure out how to get this all done together. Once you put that prerogative first, you know, I think you start partnering with patients from the first second. You know, I think there are other things that are very routine that help this. Longer appointments where a patient can express, you know, a lot more concerns and have more time to simply discuss things that are important instead of feeling rushed. You know, creating an actual established process. Quite often what I see happens especially in the consultative practices in other specialties, you know, the patients often don't have a good sense of what's happening. You know, they'll say, well, come back when I get the test done, or you will start this and then we'll see. I think quite often laying out a whole process of care, because sometimes the things are pretty complicated. You know, if the patient comes in and just had a heart attack and we need to have dramatic lifestyle change, well, I have to explain how it's going to get accomplished, or else the patient's going to feel like, well, you know, I don't really know how all of this fits. That all stimulates this relationship. And then, you know, and then another principle is really, really important. I kind of alluded to that earlier. We tend to think we know the answers, and we tend to kind of tell patients what to do. In reality, maybe for specific acute problems, well, that's probably true. But once you start talking about chronic care model problems that have been around for given patient for quite some time, I think often patients eventually will get to the point of figuring out certain things, not physicians, not clinicians, and having that angle of saying, look, I may not know the answers, you may not know the answers, but together we'll figure it out. You know, I see the biggest shifts and biggest transformations in patients when I don't necessarily tell them what they need to be doing. When we start the work together and a couple of months later they're coming in and saying, oh, you know, I remember you told me about this approach and I kind of just did these, you know, you just listed it and I went home and I researched this and I tried it and oh my God, what kind of difference does it make? You know, I want them to, like, I want them to feel that they're owning the process. You know, it's a basic concept of motivation, and I think most of us in this field at some point get some training in motivational interviewing, because without that, I think quite often what ends up happening, we just teach patients, quote unquote. We're not trying to motivate them to find the process on their own.
Yeah, that sounds very important to the process, is, you know, for someone to actually take the initiative, do some research, because as you mentioned, the doctor sometimes, or even in most cases, may not know everything, especially with each individual disease or issue. So sometimes we may need to be a little bit more proactive on our end as a patient and, you know, do some of that research, you know, maybe not self-diagnosis as we do sometimes and kind of drive ourselves crazy, but at least take the initiative.
But sometimes patients figure out what's going on, be honest with you, or they do the research and they help you to figure. I think the other big point to this is, you know, about 90% of all chronic care is reversible by lifestyle. You know, we have a very solid data that 90% of all the secondary heart attacks can be prevented by dramatic lifestyle change. You know, and the lifestyle change, yeah, of course, there's some basic expertise that is required. But in reality, you know, that's only important in the fact that once you tell the patient once, well, then they're going to have to follow it, right? And that's where things end up starting to get complicated. How do you implement this lifestyle change? Is it practical for the patient? Within that, the patient has a whole lot bigger role. And often within that, the physician has very little role because it's a health coach, nutritionist, exercise physiologist, a neighbor, a family member. They may have a lot more important role. And that's where the point of partnering becomes more than essential, because if without it, you can repeat the same information, the same advice to the patient at every visit and nothing will ever happen. I think that's part of why in a lot of primary care, and I've been there early in a career, before I fully started doing integrative medicine, I think you get very frustrated because you're really not seeing patients' improvements. You're sort of like following them, but nothing's really changing. You would put them on quote-unquote best medications, but they're still sick. They still have a lot of symptoms. They're not moving forward. Kind of like you feel stuck with the patient. The patient is stuck and you feel stuck with the patient. And, it took me quite a number of years to start realizing, first of all, I cannot unstuck them. So no matter what I say would unstuck them, quote unquote, I have to really not only partner with them, but I have to be patient and wait and really be not even the teacher. It's really, I'm just more of a friend and a coach. I am grabbing the moments when they're ready to transformation and gently motivate them to the point where they would say, oh, yeah, I get it now. I think those are for me, most valuable points in my practice right now. It's not the best treatment, the best modality, or, it's those moments of personal transformation in one's life where they suddenly, oh, my God, this light bulb goes up saying, oh, of course. That's what I should be doing. And then you see this massive weight loss or whatever it is that is going to help them. I wish it happened more often. It doesn't happen that often.
Right. And that's funny that you brought that up, because that was actually my next question. We talk so much about lifestyle, and in this country, we've become so accustomed to just being able to pop a pill for something. It's like a microwave society.
Right.
And in the question that you sort of, you started on was, I was going to ask, how do you help a person who, generally speaking, doesn't want to help themselves? But you kind of touched on that. Do you have any examples? Of course, you wouldn't name names, but any examples of kind of your own stories of helping a person or trying to help a person who it took them some time before it did click with them, or if it ever clicked?
I think it does. I think it clicks more when you're persistent with the message, when you're gentle, when you gradually coach patient towards the change instead of trying to, create the big ripples. It's a hard thing to do. I think the reason very frequently a lot of, especially busy primary care physicians, have a hard time doing this. The time is required to get to know the patient, and time is required for the patient to get to know you, because quite often the change happens not when you tell them what to do, but when you're simply talking, when you discuss things that are often could even be totally outside of their medical care. It's their neighbor did something, and I had this one great example. I have been working with one patient to try to change her diet so that her intestinal health will get better. And, I've been advocating this kind of a low-carb approach for her I felt that she had a chronic overgrowth of candida in her gut, and also she knew she had a lot of stressors in her life. And, we kept talking about this, and she's like, no, I just want another round of nystatin, which kept helping her. It's an antifungal medication. And eventually I remember she came herself one day and said, you know what? You kept telling me this, and I had this meeting with my neighbor during, a block party, and the neighbor suddenly started telling her about how wonderful she felt after her doctor told her to eat less sugar. And it clicked, like it was that moment when it clicked for her. It had nothing to do with me, but she remembered that
right.
I kept nagging.
Right.
And then she said, oh, I better call Dr. Kogan and go back and see him and tell her that. I said, well, perfect. Now it's the time, And so, but you also have to be humble enough to understand that, our desire or our need, quote unquote, to help the patient quite often gets in the way. This idea that we're going to help everybody, we're going to do this for a patient, it unfortunately is very heavily seen in this quote unquote war on cancer. And we have the wars on every condition.
Right.
And we often don't see the reality that, the moment and I have nothing against the war on cancer, trust me, I have a lot of cancer patients, that's all I'm trying to say. But the moment we put that lingo, as it's a war on something, it sets a very kind of, a specific atmosphere of defense, and so for patients it's often kind of hard to open up and let the process evolve and learn from it. There's this kind of a sense of shame almost, by this negativity, and so sometimes embracing the problem and trying to shape it into a more positive form. We don't do it for the fact that just doing that's going to somehow help the patient. We do it because we know it's a lot more motivational. Within that positivity, they'll be able to find a better approach, a better solution to whatever the treatment step that has to be taken, So if that woman would not have initiated this diet conversation during the block party, she wouldn't have heard the neighbor saying those things about her. So sharing the things. So quite often, and we've been embracing this model of medical shared groups. Quite often, the solutions are found not in the physician's office, but actually in support groups with a group of other patients who are going through the same thing. Maybe they slightly at a different phase and where they are. But often this kind of collegiality of chronic issues sometimes dramatically powerful for not just finding the solution, but as a support system.
It sounds like your initial approach is normally holistic. So when is it essential?
Tricky word.
Yeah, it can be, but I think, okay, let's define holistic first, not necessarily a specific definition, but when I say holistic, just thinking about something that's more, diet, more lifestyle, exercise, those kinds of things. So when is it essential to say that may be working slower than I want it to? When do we introduce a science-based Western practice to trying to help a patient heal? When is it, that we go away from nature?
I think it's a very tricky. I think you're trying to trick me into something. No, I'm just kidding. No. We engage scientific methods from the beginning. It's the one thing to try to tell the patient, look, let's look at your as a whole person. It's very different to say, let's look at your whole person and then apply some, voodoo medicine to you at the same time. I don't think those two things have to go in somehow one after another. I mean, I think they can be incorporated and practiced at the same time. I have no doubt, and I think that's what we do day to day. I think you bring up, though, interesting points. When you work with a patient, if the lifestyle approach is if more of a gentler, softer, maybe less efficacious, but safer modalities and even herbs, let's say, not working, then what's the next step? Right. So, I think, let me back up for a second. So we, in medicine, tend to learn everything in pyramids. There's a diet pyramid, there's an exercise pyramid, there's diagnostic pyramid, and so I feel in integrative medicine, we have our own integrative medicine pyramid. And at the base of it, we have a first line of defense. We have lifestyle, so that's meditation, exercise, stress reduction, nutrition, sleep, your relationship with others, your intimacy, your emotional balance, your mind balance. So then you move on to, more interventional things, herbs, vitamins, acupuncture, body work, movement therapies. If those fail, then you keep moving further. Then you start getting to the realm of nutraceuticals. So those are the high doses of vitamins, more direct elements like maybe more aggressive IV nutritional therapy or, some kind of modalities where things may appear to be alternative, quote unquote, but they're still, more aggressive than, say, just the basic vitamins. And then you move on to pharmaceuticals and surgery and procedures and different medical devices. So they are sitting on top. They're the smallest part of the pyramid. But they're also on top of it, right? So that means that we do acknowledge that they could be dangerous, or they could be more side effect prone, but they could also be more effective.
Right. Okay, yeah, I wasn't trying to trick you. That actually perfectly answered that question. Because I was just kidding. Yeah. But I think it can just be, to some people listening, it can be kind of confusing as to where would one normally start with integrative medicine, because we are talking about a lot, and they may want to know, okay, if I'm, just 30 pounds overweight, would the doctor, it seems like most Western doctors, if you're like 10 to 30 pounds overweight, which isn't huge, but they'll run to try to, give you a pill or some kind of prescription, a Western approach to it versus saying, hey, just cut out, maybe grains and sugar, and in 3 or 4 months you could be at a normal size, a normal weight for your height. So it's just, different approaches that, I just wanted to know if you had a way of going about it. And that pyramid is a perfect way of painting that picture.
And I can add a little bit to it. I think there are certain areas in medicine where certain medical approaches are, in my opinion, are abused. So they're dramatically overused where non-pharmacological effective methods exist. We have a great example of chronic pain where, opiates don't even work very effectively. It's a very well-established paradigm, and yet they're quite often become sometimes even first line of treatment. They should be not even a third line. They should be a last line, and yet they're the first line. The same with like a cholesterol. This great cholesterol myth that every person with elevated cholesterol for some reason should be on statins. So there's certain overuses of medical establishment, in my opinion, and honestly, I don't think they have to do more with individual prescription practices of a physician. They are simply how the financial incentives in our healthcare system are set up.
Right.
There is no incentive for a physician to sit and talk about exercise and diet. There's an incentive to write a script for simvastatin and move on to the next patient.
One thing I want to know is we have newer, I don't want to call them diseases, I guess ailments would be the perfect word, that, for instance, in sports we have brain injuries that are coming to the forefront and being discovered, but all of the research hasn't been done. And let's say you have a client, a patient, that comes to you and they may have played a combat sport or an impact sport at one point in their life, and they're experiencing some of those brain issues. How do you go about approaching that from an integrative standpoint, or do you defer them to someone else, or do you take it on? And it's a loaded question because, like I said, it's not a lot of research. A lot of research hasn't been done on it. It's fairly new. How do you tackle it from your
I think it's a great question. It's actually an uncommon question. I don't think I've ever been asked this. My sense of this would be, I think quite often the amount of evidence we need for a safe integrative approach like a diet or exercise does not need to be the same. Let me give an example. It's very clear that if I use change in diet for cancer versus, a chemotherapeutic agent for cancer, that I don't need to have, a massive amount of data to prove that something is effective. If we have a glimpses of a possible treatment for a condition that otherwise is deadly, and doesn't have effective treatment, or not deadly, but just doesn't have a lot of effective treatment, I don't think there's anything wrong with saying, look, I'm most likely sure that, this diet, this high-fat diet, for example, low-carb, high-fat diet for patients with, traumatic brain injury, or meditation, meditation and mindfulness for traumatic brain injury. I don't think I have to have, 10 years of research with dozens of double-blind, large randomized studies showing effectiveness. It's different. If I have one small study, I may say, you know what, I don't have anything else. I think the drugs for this condition are not going to work, and one should try this. So I think a lot of us in integrative medicine feel that we use evidence differently. We will still use the evidence. We just accept as what's evidenced for us quicker, I think. And, and I don't think it's a critique. I think it's just, realization that you mentioned traumatic brain injury. It's a great example because, what's out there? I mean, there's no drugs. There are few drugs that may alleviate certain symptoms, but in reality, don't cure anything. There's a lot of, at this point, most traumatic brain injury patients get put on high-dose fish oil, but they're all of their standard doctors. But 10 years ago, it wasn't done, even though in our field, we probably, all of us would put on fish oil early, this specific group of patients. So a lot of the data, it really depends on who looks at the data. And, with the conditions that don't have effective treatment from the beginning, I think those are actually the ones that integrative medicine practitioners end up seeing a lot of, because just how this field works. I mean, unfortunately, what we end up often seeing is diseases that are pretty progressed when patient has tried everything under the sun, and finally they say, well, I don't know what else to do. And, I get these referrals all the time where primary care physicians say, well, I don't know what else to do. Why don't you go see him? Maybe he'll come up with something. And so often we wish that we would have patients earlier, let's say, in a process of their traumatic brain injury. And, and we have a certain number of effective treatment, neurofeedback, different mind-body practices, certain nutritional support. So it's not that there is, but by the way, some of these approaches require a lot of patients' time. Sometimes they're not covered by insurance. They may require quite substantial, like neurofeedback may require a very substantial out-of-pocket expense. So, and often it's also a practice setup. So, my practice, for example, may be set up to see patients like this better than primary care practice where they don't even have psychologists.
And I actually asked that question because I know that it was a blanket question for even other, maybe not even brain injuries, but other similar injuries or issues that people may have where it's so scary. When you hear that something might be wrong with your brain, it's so scary that if the doctor tells you, okay, just eat grain foods, take fish oil, eat more blueberries, meditate, and eat avocados, it just doesn't feel like it's good enough. Because it's your brain. Right. You feel like, well, maybe he should have given me a pill. I'm just thinking in this country, that's probably the mindset. And so that's why.
Let me give you an example. Let me give you an example where this mindset is going to change in the next couple of years dramatically. So disease of Alzheimer's, we currently have a process of cure or reversal of Alzheimer's. We've had it for the past couple of years. It's not based on any single drug approach. Right, and it's all based on a lifestyle and a dramatic lifestyle change and a modification of anywhere from couple to maybe 30 risk factors that are complex but diagnosable. And, and if I approach this process like this and I tell the patient this is what you need to do, and their reaction would be, wait a second, but all you're trying to do is just to change my diet, put me on a couple of supplements, tell me to meditate, fast regularly once every other day or whatever, and do this cognitive, and that's enough? I say, yeah. The incentive in a situation like this, I would say, well, you don't have to do this, because what is your alternative? I mean, you're going to take this drug, Aricept or Namenda, and you're going to decline maybe 6 months later, but you're going to decline, and you will and you have your time, your brain is going to be very limited in what it can do now, and in a couple of years, you probably won't even remember. We just had this conversation. And, the reality is once it becomes patients are very heavily incentivized by knowing what's out there. So they come back and say, oh, yeah, you're right. I don't care, what I feel now because, I want to try because I don't have anything else to try. So that incentive of desperation, unfortunately, still, I think, is one of the most prevalent in our field. I hope in the future, as the field grows, that incentive will change towards, oh, yeah, that problem is managed by integrative medicine the best, and regular is not, so I'm going to go there first. Yeah. But we're not quite there. I think we're not quite there.
That is, and that actually leads me to this question, which is, what is your outlook regarding the future of integrative medicine?
Honestly, I think it's positive but guarded. I think that would be the right way to say. I think it's positive because I understand that patients themselves, there's a market drive, right? So the patients themselves are going to keep looking and keep demanding these services. I think it's guarded because I think the whole healthcare system outlook right now is guarded, and I don't want to go into politics of this, but, I have this belief, it's not my belief, that Americans will do everything wrong until there's nothing wrong to do left, and then we'll do something right. So I think that's really applicable towards our healthcare system, unfortunately. So I'm, kind of an observer. We are the only country that doesn't have single-payer system out of all the developed world. We're spending 10 times more than every other country, and yet really our outcomes are mediocre at best. So there's all these issues. So that's partially why I'm hesitant to be saying, oh, it's a very bright future. I think it's very bright in certain areas. I think it's extremely bright in the area of neurodegeneration. I think the area of neurodegeneration is a completely lost basket for regular medical field. It's just there's nothing there. You mentioned traumatic brain injury. I told you Alzheimer's, Parkinson's disease is not cured, it's just supported. So there are conditions where I think our whole person addressing root cause of the problem are getting so sophisticated and so effective at the core that eventually it's just going to be a flood of effective treatments that's going to overpower even the insurance market is going to have to eventually catch up. When it's going to happen, I don't know. Another very interesting current situation of massive change is chronic pain. The guidelines on chronic back pain that were put out by American College of Physicians in April stated very clearly that the first line for treatment of chronic back pain is non-pharmacological alternative approaches. Acupuncture, massage, chiropractic, body manipulation, and not drugs, and definitely not opiates. And if any drug, then it's things like NSAIDs or muscle relaxants. And that's a game changer, because that means that if it's a first guideline of such magnitude for the entire field of chronic pain, of chronic back pain, well, if it's a major organization put out that guideline, it means that the insurers have to follow. Now, will they?
Yeah.
I will see. I don't know. Currently, I think there is a Medicare bill for acupuncture. It's been sitting there on a hill for forever. I think one example of where things get embraced rapidly is the VA system. I think the VA and DOD have embraced this, and I think they're very quickly putting things in. Every major VA hospital in the country beginning to, have this integrative modalities. The DVA has what's called IHW, Integrative Health and Wellness, and they offer acupuncture, massage, different classes like Tai Chi, yoga, meditation, biofeedback. So they're pretty quickly investing into these things. It's not without its problems. VA is a big bureaucratic machinery, but they created the whole central office that is led by Tracy Gadet, who used to run Duke Integrative Medicine Center. and Tracy in charge of this Office of Patient-Centered Care. And under Tracy, Dr. Ben Kligler, who used to run Beth Israel's Center for Health and Healing, was hired to develop this integrative medicine model for the entire central VA. So I think things in VA going to run quicker than in a private world. I think they're going to start seeing dramatically improved patient outcomes, and they're not going to. Some of the research they're already doing, it's not randomized. So and you don't have to. You can do a pragmatic study to show, well, if the patient goes to this clinic versus that patient goes to that clinic, the patient in the integrative clinic seems to have better outcomes. Well, the system will have an incentive to put more resources into this. And it would be done this way rather than waiting for some double-blind randomized controlled trials trying to show that meditation is better than this pill. I think that's. I don't think we should be waiting for that. I think we shouldn't even be doing this. That's my opinion.
But I think that's a pretty positive outlook. I think that's actually the chronic pain explanation is a very good outlook for integrative medicine, I think, because I had a family member who had chronic pain in her back, and she went the surgical route, and that's always kind of tricky on a back, because I learned in school, this is about the back, the bones in the back, and how they heal or not or don't heal. And she still, even years after the surgery, still has pain, and she's considering another surgery. And it's like, well, that doesn't seem to be the best way of doing it. But what you just explained is that they probably wouldn't even, if she were to see an integrative medicine doctor today, they probably wouldn't even suggest surgery. They might suggest something else.
Right.
So,
or if they will suggest surgery, they will say something like, well, why don't you try this first for a couple of months? Let's see if that helps.
Right.
Instead of going straight. Because right now, one part of the problem, if you don't have it in your system, if the approach is not available, well, you're not going to recommend it. Vets are often unable to go outside and pay for the services out of pocket. So it's another. I think the bigger problem, or why I'm kind of guarded, I think that idea that all of these services will soon be covered by insurance, or that they will become more accessible for wider public, I think is wrong. I don't think that will happen. I think we'll go backwards. I think there's going to be increased pressure to cover less some of these services, mostly because there's pressure to cover less of everything.
Oh, yeah. That's true.
And the system keeps getting more and more expensive, and insurers tend to push more and more things onto the patient. And integrative medicine, I think, for quite a long time is not going to be seen as a kind of, a first-line defense. It'll still be looked upon as a kind of a, oh, you're a little fish in a big pond, and no, we need a bigger fish first. And that in itself desensitizes the going through insurance. I think eventually for certain things like the pain I mentioned, I can't imagine that in the next couple of years, even the Medicare will not cover the acupuncture for pain. But we're going to see these issues are, okay, well, they'll cover it. They'll say, no, we're going to pay whatever, $50 for a visit. The reality, we all know how insurance works, because having something covered by insurance doesn't necessarily mean that the patient is going to have an access to a provider who's going to accept that insurance. So issues are very multi-layered, and unfortunately, that's why I'm saying guarded. It may appear that I'm sounding optimistic, but I'm guarded because I know the reality, once things get implemented, what's written on the paper, it's very different from what's in real life.
Right.
I didn't grow up in U.S. I grew up in Russia, where, laws are written on the paper, would be implemented maybe 1 out of 100.
Okay, so Dr. Kogan, you were just about to tell us about Russia, and that was leading me into my last question as far as, we want to know who we're talking to, because we usually like to jump into our questions, and we get into who are we talking to, where do you come from, what is your focus, and all that great stuff. So you can go ahead and continue and tell us about yourself.
Yeah, so, I actually never knew early in life that I'll be doing what I'm doing now. I grew up in Russia during a perestroika, the very turmoily period where, suddenly the whole country was up in dramatic transformation, both politically and economically. My family was in a very stable, pretty, I would say, upscale kind of, level. Both my parents were top engineers in military, in military industrial complex. And so suddenly all of this stability was kind of totally removed under our feet, and we were finding ourselves in this kind of a murky water of what's next. And that's when I took off, because I just felt that, it was too uncertain. I didn't know what's going to happen. So I left. I left when I was actually 18. So I left first to Israel, and then a couple of years later I came to U.S. And I sort of tried myself in research, realized that I really need people to talk to, can talk to the tubes. It wasn't my thing. And I also, at that time, I really hated writing. I think I still hate writing, but less. And so I kind of doubled in that, and then I thought I'll be doing veterinary school. And then this is sort of partially why I came where I came. So I turned out had a horrible allergies to cats and dogs. I would have a severe asthmatic reaction. So I tried to work in a veterinary office for a couple of months just to get a experience and, get on my resume that I did it. Partially, but partially I just wanted it. And, and I was so sick after each time I would spend time in that office. And so I still remember I got accepted at the University of Pennsylvania veterinary program, and I was about to drop in the final agreement to the application, and it kind of hit me, in order for me to do this, I'll have to take antihistamines for the rest of my life. And that was a very transformational moment. And part of me, I guess, how I grew up, my parents never really forced any medical. We had a very healthy lifestyle. We always took very active vacations, hiking and kayaking. And we always ate very good food. So I felt like my upbringing was very health conscious. And here I was basically committing my professional life, requiring me to take the, Zyrtec for the rest of my life. And I couldn't see myself do it. So I dropped out. And then about a year later, I was still working at Penn in research. And my advisor at postgraduate studies said, well, why don't you try to medical school? Because you may like research. And then I kind of got in like this without really knowing what the hell am I getting into. And then in the third year, I almost quit. And so it gotten to the point where I felt that the medicine was nothing but the industrial complex. I was in a OBGYN rotation, and, I delivered one baby at the very busy hospital, and I did like 20 C-sections. And I was like, is this really, how is this? I always envision medicine, this kind of a catering to health and maintaining health. And here it was like, I'm seeing only sickness, and I'm not really seeing my way out of it. And so I started to kind of thinking how to get out of it financially. And then, how the life path always throw us, the saving moment. And so I get this email in inbox saying, hey, there's this retreat happening for medical students. It's all about this holistic health. And I was like, what is that? But I'll go, And so I found a bunch of people at it was AMSA, American Medical Students Association, and I started meeting, people like Andrew Weil and Rachel Raymond. And things really quickly start realizing, wait a second, there's this whole underground, well, at that point it was already coming underground, field of people practicing things dramatically different. And when that happened, so I gotten into the fourth year of medical school, and I took a rotation in New York with Ron Hoffman. He's a functional medicine guy. And, he was talking to me briefly about, myself, and I'm like, well, I have all these allergies. He's like, well, let me take a look at you. So he looked at me, looked at my mouth, says, oh, yeah, of course. Well, look, you have a whole mouth full of mercury fillings. I bet that's a problem. So he ran my test. I had a horrendous toxicity for mercury because on top of that, guess what? I love fish. And I was eating all kinds of fish, and tuna and lobster were my favorite seafood. So, and then it took about 10 years for me, but I don't know what allergies are at this point. Allergies completely went away gradually. And so this kind of set me on this path with, also my personal history and also seeing what is out there and what you can do and how things can be managed dramatically different from what we used to. And that I think was, for me, it's this combination of my background not wanting to do a standard medicine because it felt too devoted of actual health, and then this personal health challenge that led me to dramatic improvement in my life. One of the issues why I'm so heavily involved in the cognitive impairment now, when I was in my 20s and 30s, I couldn't recall faces and names. So I would see a person and I will not be able to remember them again. I would not remember their name, and they will say, "Oh, hi," and I'm like, "Who are you?" And it would take me weeks to memorize someone. I would not even memorize names of my classmates. That's how bad it was. And that's one of the key elements of mercury toxicity, this kind of a memory cognitive effect. And all of that went away. My cognitive capacity for memorization improved dramatically. And you can imagine, for me to have a bad memory going through medical school, right? So it's now so much better that, and back then I was pretty young. So the fact that it affected me at that young age, now I understand all these pieces of a puzzle, because there's also genetic mutation that makes me slower detoxifier. So I have to constantly be careful my bucket of toxicity is half full all the time, because I can't remove toxins as well as some other people. So personal life journey led me, at least in part, to this, in terms of my own health challenge.
Mm-hmm. And you're at GW, a director over at GW. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So we have a Center for Integrative Medicine at GW. It's partially affiliated with universities, so we're separate. I have control over how we want to run it. But on the other hand, we're academically strongly linked. So we provide all the clinical education to students and residents and fellows. But we also have Office of Integrative Medicine, which a founder of our clinic, Dr. John Penn, is directing right now. So the office is just starting. The official announcement is going to go out in just a few weeks. So we had a grateful patient who founded this new office, and that's going to bring integrative medicine in DC to a new level, because we will not only keep providing good clinical care, but we are going to start increasing amount of educational activities very quickly. We already have an online master's programs in integrative medicine and fellowship that is fellows who take the program capable of taking the board of integrative medicine. It's called American Board of Integrative Medicine, or ABOIM. And that board is a main certifying body for physicians who want to show that they're credentialed in this field. And so that's exciting. So we have all these programs. And then the School of Medicine has explosion of different education. We have culinary medicine program. We now it's developing a mindfulness elective. We have 2-week medical school students can take 2 weeks with us at the Integrative Center. So it's a 2 weeks integrative medicine elective. So in that sense, I think education-wise, the future is bright. My main concern is whether that education is going to long-term translate into a better patient care, and one can only hope.
And where can we find out more information about this? Does it have a website?
Yeah, so for clinical things, people can visit our website. It's www.gwcim, so George Washington Center for Integrative Medicine, GWCIM, 5 letters. If people are interested in finding out about GW University Master's in Integrative Medicine Graduate Certificate or Fellowship Program, the best way is just to Google. The URL for that is pretty complicated. So if you just Google GW Integrative Medicine Master's Program or Fellowship, the first thing that comes up is our program.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
And is there anything else you want us to know about yourself or the center or anything like that before we let you go?
Well, I have a book coming up on integrative care for elderly.
Of course. Go ahead. Tell us all about
Integrative,
it.
Integrative Geriatric Medicine. And that's a part of Andrew Weil's series. So that's going to be released in early November. It's a textbook, but I'm now writing the second book, which would be more public-based. So my main passion is in care of the elderly, mostly because, I'm a geriatrician by training. That's what ends up happening with, I didn't tell you that part of the story. But, and that's out of all the fields of, I think, where we overusing our medical approaches, I think in field of geriatrics, it's most obvious. If you ever been to nursing home and you ever looked at list of medications that each person in a nursing home is on, you would probably have a heart attack.
Wow.
Because some patients are on 30, 40 medications. And it's very scary, but that's how we practice, unfortunately. We practice it this way because we don't think that there's a better ways. And so I think my life goal or my life path is to say that, nope, there are better ways. And I think there are not only better ways, but I think they're a lot more efficient and effective and less costly. I think keeping ourselves healthy even into golden ages of 80, 90, or 100 is totally doable. And this idea that in this country, we're afraid of aging. We think that people, past 65, it's all downhill. That's a very negative way of seeing this, and I think it's plain wrong. I see a lot of people in their 70s and 80s keeping a vibrant life, taking 0 medications, exercising, doing what they want to do, and more importantly, they often have resources to do it. Even though we also think that people 65 plus on a limited income, that's often true, but they also don't have to go to work every day. So there's things that can be. They're right. Yeah. They have more time for things that often, you and I may not want to engage in, but as they say, you grow old and wise, and when you grow old and wise, your priorities shift. And I think that's partially why I'm picked this field, because I want to constantly be reminded that often our priorities that we think important now may not be as important to us in a couple of years. I think keeping our internal eye open to ever-changing presence of life, I think we often forget. We often end up being too revved up in our own personal journey. I think having external reminders. Bottom line, my work is never boring. And also geriatric patients, I actually hate word geriatrics, we're coming up with better words right now in the middle of trying to come up. So if any of your listeners have an idea for how to describe a process of getting older, healthier, they have one word for that. And if it's a good word, please have them call me.
Okay.
But anyway.
And your book, will your book does it have a website, or will it have a website?
No, well, it's a Oxford University Press, so it's a large publishing house.
Okay.
So it'll be on their website. Yeah.
Oh, wonderful. Well, thank you so much. This was such a wonderful talk that you gave us for the last hour we did for DTY Talks.
Well, thank you so much. I definitely enjoyed this.
Yeah, likewise. It was wonderful. So thank you again for taking part in our talk.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.